Awesome, thank you. I don't have to raise my voice. Well, thank you all for being here today. My name is Tanya Allen. I'm an associate professor in Art, Design and Technology and Design Studies over in the College of Design. And I'm also a faculty fellow with the Center for Geospatial Analytics. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Kofi Boone, who is a Joseph D. Moore Distinguished Professor and University Faculty Scholar here at NC State in the College of Design and Landscape Architecture. Kofi is a Detroit native and a graduate of the University of Michigan. His work is in the overlap between landscape architecture and environmental justice, with specializations in democratic design and interpreting cultural landscapes. He's the winner of Student and Professional ASLA, which is the Landscape Architecture Society, awards including the John D. Carpenter Teaching Medal. He's past president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation and serves on the board of the Land Loss Prevention Project. In 2019, Kofi was recognized as the most admired educator by Design Intelligence for successfully blending academic and community interests in his seminars and studios. His article, The Resilience of Ruinous Futures, laid the foundation for popularizing the concept of racialized topography in landscape architecture analysis. He's published work broadly in peer-reviewed as well as popular media, including The Conversation, the Journal of Landscape and Urban Planning, and Landscape Architecture magazine. Kofi is co-editor of Empty Pedestals, Countering Confederate Narratives Through Public Design, which was published in 2024 by the LSU Press. And currently, Kofi is establishing the Just Communities Lab, a place for collaborative work with communities providing environmental design and planning technical assistance to environmental justice challenges. And I'll just say on a personal note, I have had the immense pleasure of working with Kofi in a lot of different capacities and really appreciate and admire his approach to community engagement and facilitating discussion that elevates an incredible diversity of voices. He's also an incredible lecturer and lots of interesting content and so engaging, and I'm sure he's going to give a great. Take it away, Kofi.
So it's too high a bar, Tanya. It's too high a bar. It's Friday, it's the afternoon. We'll see where the energy goes, but I do want to thank my colleague and my friend Tanya for that wonderful introduction. We will get right to it. It's good to see friendly faces. So every Bartlett here has suffered through one of my classes. I don't recognize other faces, but we'll see. I'd be remiss without a few shameless plugs. So as Tanya mentioned, the book on the right, Empty Pedestals, is a work that took about 5 years to get through. That was inspired by things that happened here in our own backyard. And for people who want to know more about our degree program and what landscape architecture is broadly, our open house is in a couple of weeks. So you're welcome to join us if you want to. And a shout out to Tanya and her colleague, Sarah Queen, who provided some really amazing data visualization that helped us understand the time, the geography, the background of a lot of Confederate monuments and memorials and all the infrastructure that it has imparted. So thank you for that. I was asked to respond to a few specific questions, so I'm going to follow the script. It's easy to follow the script. How has your career trajectory led to you using a geospatial perspective? That's an excellent question. So as mentioned, I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I grew up about a mile away from that photograph. That's the Detroit River, right between the city of Detroit and Belle Isle Park, which was our major island park where we were. That's Belle Isle there. It was initially designed by Frederick Olmsted. It's a little bit bigger than Central Park. Detroit is the largest US city north of Canada, so that map is correct. Detroit is in the top part and Windsor's in the bottom, and that's where I got my first introduction to the environment. There are a lot of things that have been said about Detroit, which I'll reinforce in a second, but it's also important to know that after World War II, it was considered one of the most livable cities in America. Highest rate of home ownership, most sophisticated infrastructure, and amazing designers. So if you're into mid-century modernist design, it's Mecca, right? So that's Cranbrook Academy, just north of the city, designed by Eero and Eliel Saarinen, which is where their office was when they were alive. But as many of you already know, Detroit is about 30% vacant. In my lifetime, it's equivalent to losing 25,000 people a year, every year. So about 1 million people left the city of Detroit in my lifetime, which has left an incredible amount of infrastructure, which is shown geospatially by the brown dots on the map. And so that living circumstances led to a lot of different responses in terms of how to deal with it. This is a prominent local artist from Detroit, Tyree Guyton, who decided to voice frustration with this investment in the city through public art, taking over streets, taking over houses, and kind of this explosion of cast-off elements to symbolize cast-off people and cast-off places. Detroiters have a certain kind of mindset and an ethic based on that. When I was in your shoes, I got exposed to this guy, Frederick Olmsted. A couple of years ago was his 200th birthday, among other things, along with Calvert Vaux, designed Central Park. One of the central figures of the City Beautiful movement, was a key figure in the sanitation department. He was able to weave together all these elements that professionalized landscape architecture in the United States. He has a very interesting backstory, which if time allows, I can get into, but the short point I want to make is that when most people think of landscape architecture, they think of that. They either think of people's yards or they think of parks. And Central Park, for many ways, is the template for a lot of how we think about parks and recreation today. But Frederick Olmsted did a lot in his life. Interesting enough, not trained in landscape architecture or design. He's a really smart guy. So the Emerald Necklace, the system of open spaces that define Boston, from the Common all the way to Back Bay, was initially conceived as a sanitation project, not a recreation project. Because at that time in Boston's history, there were open sewers and people were getting really sick. So it was Olmsted and his team that came in and said, well, we can address this through treating water and today what we would call nature-based solutions, but also afford all these other opportunities to create city-defining space. And when you go to Central Park and you can go across the street to Pullen Park, when people mention natural, none of it is. Every blade of grass in Central Park was planted, every tree was. The only thing that was in Central Park before was developed with rocks. So when you go to public places and start to see things intentionally designed in this way, it sometimes can help you understand that through a nature-based solution, we can solve multiple problems and not just recreation. So that was an eye-opener for me to think that it could deal with social issues, public health issues, justice issues at the same time. One of my friends now, is kind of cool now, being a professor, a book you read, not very friend. Ann Spern got us thinking about this in terms of the city not being separate from nature. And that's an important assertion that is popularized by most folks in the environmental justice movement, that nature is not out there somewhere. It's not just birds and bunnies, it's wherever you live. Wherever there's an environment. So the Granite Garden was one of the important ones in which she talked about the legacy of Olmsted. Public spaces to the health of the city. In our own backyard, grad student from 1976 invented the Capitol Area Greenway as a student master's project. So the Greenway system that we benefit from today, and based on how you track the legacy of greenways, there are previous linked park systems and parkways, but one of the first greenways in our country is the Capitol Area Greenway. It was designed as a buffer system to protect sensitive waterways from what then was explosive growth in the region, and has layered on accumulated other roles. But what's important is that was speculation from the student that led to that. So even in our own backyard, we see these attempts to deal with multiple benefits that natural and nature-based solutions can provide. Of course, at the same period of time, and this is when I was at Michigan, when North Carolina was just something on the map and some guy named Jordan won the championship. That's pretty much all we knew about North Carolina. We didn't even know about Jimmy V. We had no idea. But at that time, PCB protests within PCB, sadly, back on our radar because of discoveries in Pole Hall and other places on our campus. In 1982 in Warren County, about an hour north of us, PCB landfill, there was a requirement to remove and dispose of PCBs, and the company that was removing and disposing of them were just spraying them indiscriminately in the drainage ways of state highways. They got caught and had to reclaim all those PCBs that they dumped in those drainage ways and put them in a landfill. And nobody wants a landfill full of PCBs. So they did an analysis to figure out what communities could offer the least amount of political resistance to it. And that's the beginning of this movement of what was called environmental racism, targeting communities in particular because of their low power, low access to control. These Warren County is significant for a lot of reasons. I got in front, Reverend Ben Chavis, leading that particular protest, the same namesake as John Chavis, the park that's only a mile away. One of his descendants, as a leader of United Church of Christ, issued a report, Toxic Waste and Race, which was the first time that they correlated toxic waste and demographics in the United States in a systematic way. So this sort of early precedent of how geospatial techniques and tools could be used to at least visualize a very powerful correlation that independent of income, independent of education level, independent of community type, the biggest predictor of your proximity to toxic waste in 1987 was race. And so this was a huge sea change, the idea that these anecdotes of individual communities fighting these issues grew up into an evidence-supported and data-supported movement is now what really catalyzed what we now know as the global environmental justice movement. The other key component with the environmental justice movement was the creation of the collaborative problem-solving models. So the idea that data alone wasn't enough, but finding ways to authentically engage and empower the communities who are on the front lines of these situations was important as well. To which we owe a debt of gratitude to Congressman Harold Mitchell, who's now retired, but from South Carolina, the Arkwright site in his hometown of Spartanburg, South Carolina, which was one of the most toxic sites in the whole country. But through his coalition building was able to put together a multi-racial and multi-institutional stakeholder group to not only remediate that particular site, but then to go back and invest in health systems, in affordable housing, access to open space and infrastructure. And they kind of looked at what they did to do that, and they backtracked and created this model, which is required if you get a grant from EPA using environmental justice. It forms the basis of a lot of the engagement that we do in the lab. Tanya made a comment about racialized topography. It's important to talk about environmental justice issues have gone beyond just toxics and have started to help us have a critical lens to look at land use, to look at transportation and infrastructure, and to look at it historically and over time. And so we can use our own community as a case of this. One reason why the state capitol in Raleigh is where it is it's on a ridge between Crabtree Creek and Walnut Creek. It was established during the period of enslavement and American slavery. And a lot of African Americans and Black people were reliant on their lifestyle of proximity to the city, but couldn't live in the city. So many self-built in edges of established communities and largely in low-lying areas. And in the case of Raleigh, Rochester Heights, the first Black subdivision built on Black-owned land, was built in the floodplain of Walnut Creek. Now, that sounds stupid to y'all because y'all are natural resource people and you know you're not supposed to build in floodplain, right? But if you go across about 150 southern cities, there's a report from Hewlin and Wharf that coined the term racialized topography. They came up with a model where you could correlate altitude or height and elevation with race across southern cities. Why would that be the case? Well, because of slavery, right? And that Black people and people who weren't white landowners couldn't own the prime land. So they didn't have GIS, geospatial technology to tell them where a floodplain was, but they knew anecdotally, oh, that place is flooded. Oh, that place is a swamp. No, we're not building there. We're gonna put noxious uses down there. We're claiming the high ground. So anybody else who wasn't in that class had to kind of get in where they fit in. This has a legacy impact because there are a lot of communities that have formed place attachment to these low-lying areas that put them in harm's way. And it repeats as you move through the Southeast. Many communities with climate change and other factors are at higher risk because of things that happened generations ago. That's an aerial of Raleigh and Walnut Creek, and on the left and on the right is the floodplain and floodway, and you can see in that red square that community is squarely and has been in harm's way. But one thing that was inspiring coming to North Carolina from Michigan was that there was a great environmental justice organization that had already been established. And that one, Partners for Environmental Justice, were the people from that particular community, and they had a really unique proposition of how to deal with it. That link to design, and that's going to be the rest of this conversation, is that geospatial analysis and design have connections. There are things that we can be doing together. That's Dr. Norman Camp, who got his PhD in chemistry from here, but was a lifelong generational resident of Southeast Raleigh. And he reached out to the College of Design and a few faculty members to help with the vision of a Walnut Creek Wetland Park and Education Center. He felt that if there was a way to educate people about the value of this place and the history of the place, that they would defend it and they'd have more allies to help in times of need. Turns out he was right. That's the Walnut Creek Wetland Education Center, renamed in his and his wife's honor now, the Norman and Betty Camp Walnut Creek Education Center, where thousands of kids come every year. They have programs in the park. The park is under completion now. It's not quite done, but it's pretty close to completion. But that's an example of how we move from, the grievance part of it, justified, to proactive and positive sustainable solutions that empower local people. In landscape architecture, our introduction to geospatial analysis and technology comes from this guy. This is Ian McCarg. He's the founding head of the landscape architecture program at University of Pennsylvania. And Design with Nature, which came out in 1969, was one of the first popular books that talked about what he called the layer cake method, but essentially when it got digitized became the geospatial method for understanding landscapes and the harm that we do. So by isolating different elements on layers, which he learned from foresters in Germany and practices that predate two wars, he took the techniques that were used by foresters and forestry management and expanded it broadly to broader landscape management with the innovations of remote sensing and the ability to isolate information. So this idea of I'm going to put soils on one layer, I'm going to put vegetation on another, I'm going to put buildings on one layer, and I'm going to start layering these things to see where there are coincidences and where there are sensitive areas. And in his day, a really simple three code, kind of way of dealing with it. Areas that are developable, right? That have few constraints, areas that you need to preserve because of their ecological function and value, and areas that need to be conserved, which means you can modify them, but you have to do them respectfully in response to those issues. So believe it or not, again, this is another student thing, like all the drawings in that book, all the analysis that's presented. Ian McCarg, I met him. I like him because he was potty mouth. But diligent student work that talked about the potential for alternative futures, that we didn't have to just continue at that time with how development was being carried out in the 1960s. So he was the one that introduced a lot of us to this way of thinking. He inspired Carl Steinitz. Carl Steinitz started to take these methods and systematize them and develop them in more sophisticated ways. One of Carl Steiner's students was Jack Dangermond. And so if you use any Esri product, Jack Dangermond founded Esri. So if you use ArcGIS and ArcMaps, that all comes out of landscape architecture. So that's how I got interested in this particular kind of topic, is in terms of landscape architecture, we use it, but we don't use it to its full capacity. And one thing that I was really interested in was how can it be used as a decision-making tool or to assist with those tools when we have to deal with issues of justice and equity in the landscape. The second question, what role do geospatial approaches play in what you do? All right, so let's talk about that. So way back when, and I don't know if she's in the room, but Charlene Smith called her up because we got a call from folks in Durham, along the Durham, the American Tobacco Trail. There was a spike in crimes on the tobacco trail, and they were trying to figure out what it was about. And it was at the time when a new bridge was being proposed over I-40. So we'll go to the punchline, we won. There was a bridge over I-40, but that was in jeopardy because there was a perception that it was going to be a super highway for crime and criminals to get across to the wealthy areas of Durham. So they were concerned that this project was in jeopardy, which would jeopardize a regional linkage, which is even much bigger than it was at the time. So we spent a lot of time with Rail Trails Conservancy and stakeholders all across Durham to get a better understanding of how the trail system interacted with the community and its role. With regards to geospatial analytics, I called up Charlene asking for a research assistant that could help with the geospatial component of this. But in this methodology, as you can see on the wheel, was a mixed method. So we had stakeholder meetings with various communities along the Greenway. We did geospatial analysis with some characteristics I'll talk about in a second. We did community events popping up, and actually you'll see pictures from one in the highest crime spot in Durham, to actually talk to people and get firsthand observations. We had about 750 to 800 surveys, both in paper and online. So it was 4 different methods, including direct observation of the entire trail network with different factors. And we tried to use some theory about what we know about spatial analysis and the qualities of place and how they could contribute, be neutral, or move against crime. A lot of, at the time I called it gobbledygook, but a lot of empty analysis on the left, looking at different various factors. But maybe the most telling one was the portrayal was in a 2-year period that, as you can see, 3,500 crimes were committed within a 15-minute buffer area of the trail over 2 years. And you can see based on the colors where the concentrations were more in the northern end. But it turns out only 14 were committed on the trail, which is 7 per year. Now, you don't want crime at all anywhere. But 7 crimes in 365 days on a trail that's not lit and not connected to anything, we had to kind of make the case that what we were really talking about was a community dynamic, not a trail dynamic. To add to that, this is the spot where the bulk of that hot spot of crimes occurred. We did pop-up events there with local people and asked them to play what we call design games, give them the opportunity to not only describe these places in their own terms, in terms of things that they saw as safe, things they didn't, connections they wanted, connections they didn't want, but to propose things like where would you put a light, where would you put a tree, where would you put a bench, like actually engage these people in the design process. So we had a really good turnout and really good responses to that. But what it also helped us understand when we went way out with geospatial analysis was how segregated Durham actually is and how much the American Tobacco Trail is a divider between 2 very different communities, right? So moving west, you're getting the Forest Hills and some of the most affluent communities in Durham, and the fact that it was a former rail line, the rail line was in the back, right, in industrial use, that was a boundary between that and the Hayti community. And the Hayti community has been disrupted for generations, most significantly from freeways and urban renewal. But the fact that you're moving along this seam between 2 communities that don't really engage with one another was really what was going on. It wasn't anything about the specific characteristics of the trail, with a few exceptions. So this is where the design part kicked in, which was because it was a rail, it was the back door of everything. So there are no eyes on it. There are no clear crossings with front-facing infrastructure like streets or buildings. It pretty much had all the characteristics you would never do for a public space, crime or no crime. So what we wanted to do was to clean it up, right? And say we're going to have, formal entries, we're going to have real connections when it overlaps with real front-facing public infrastructure and land uses. And we started to create visualizations of what that might look like, transforming different intersections of the trail and the street to help the city of Durham with their future planning. Another one that we just finished was with the Lower Ellerby Creek Watershed Association based in Durham around them making a case to the city of Durham to acquire a heron rookery. And in this particular case, the watershed of the Lower Ellerby Creek is pretty good sized. Captures most of the runoff from northeast Durham, including downtown. Some of the most underserved communities in our city are in this drainage way. So in many cases, there are pieces and elements of spaces where people can interact with other species, have experiences in the woods, that for various reasons they don't. And so part of our analysis wasn't just figuring out how to make the case to persuade the city of Durham to give this heron rookery to this organization. The other one was how do we connect these local communities that have a number of issues more strongly to the natural features that define them. That shows impervious surface, and so anybody knows impervious surface water runs out faster, runs downhill. So northern part of Durham is contributing heavily to water quality in these places. We tried to talk through how point and non-point sources of pollution function and operate, so that people understood that it's not always just what's next door. Most creeks and streams in our region are considered impaired. And the stretch of water that we were connecting to, you can see, had some of the poorest water quality in our region. So we worked with ECWA and also with Duke. Duke developed a prioritization analysis model to help the organization prioritize parcels to consider for conservation through different lenses. So in some cases, it was accessibility, like how close an open space was to various communities. In another case, it was equity. Where are there places that don't have a lot of access to open space and should be a priority there? Some spaces are better or worse for biodiversity by establishing landscape corridors and allowing animals to move more freely. And in other cases, there are some parcels that are best suited for protecting water quality. So we took all that to account. We added a cultural layer because this is the same area where after the Stagville plantation end of enslavement occurred, free African Americans established their first free communities just south of there in what's now known as Bragtown. And Bragtown is in one of these, in this watershed as well. So we worked with them. We did a lot of on-site walks with people. There's a thing called biophobia, which is true. There are people who are deathly afraid of nature because they've had really horrible experiences in it. And so this idea of acclimatizing people to it and helping people understand you don't have to be afraid of it, something that can provide mental restoration, physical access to activity, was really a learning curve for some folks. We had in situ events. Right now you see some of the RAs at the bottom there at the Beaver Marsh, which has another interesting story in Durham. But in the end, we tried to get out of the jargon and just talk about big buckets of how can we promote health, how can we promote safety, and how can we promote heritage, both natural and cultural, in our strategies. So this plan is hard to read, and I apologize for that, but it shows the recommendations that came out of the analysis, places for the organization to consider for conservation, and linkages between them. The heron rookery is in the middle, highlighted in yellow. It's one of the few places in the city of Durham where there are giant nests and the water quality is sufficient where herons can do their thing. That's a zoomed in version where we use geospatial analysis to negotiate with adjacent property owners and look at real estate and look at property ownership so that the linkages we wanted to create between open spaces, both existing and proposed, going from Elleby Creek all the way to the VZ Farm Preserve, which is in the lower right of that diagram, which will become the largest holding, it is now, the largest holding conservation land by Equinel, how we might make those connections happen. And so geospatial information helped with persuading adjacent landowners and stakeholders to buy into that broader vision. And we used visualizations to help people understand the experience of it. Most people can't read maps. Shouldn't really have to read maps, to be honest with you. Most people gain their understanding from experience. So we did visualizations of what it might feel like to be in different places along the way. Project we just finished is with the North Carolina Department of Transportation. I mentioned the Hayti community before, but the state, at least these entities at NCDOT, recognize the harm that's been done by transportation planning and infrastructure across the state. In part because they want to get in line for federal funding to heal that. Right? There's federal funding now available to go back into communities that were destroyed by freeways and invest in them to make them stronger. So it's a multidisciplinary project with a lot of players, including folks from ITRI, Integrated Transportation Research and Education on our campus, and UNC Charlotte, their geospatial group. Their number of goals, but the point I wanted to make was we looked at case studies, looked at about 9 communities in the different regions of the state, and did deep dives on 3, one in each region, one in Asheville, the Burton Street community and what happened there, Durham with Hayti, Princeville with the 64 bypass. To take a moment on Durham, redlining became a thing. Redlining was the homeowners loan corporation's plan in the 1920s to code communities for their eligibility for investment loans and insurance. And the number one criteria that they used was the racial profile of the owners of the property. So the blue and the green, that's a map of Durham. We're predominantly white and wealthy. Yellow, mixed, red, black. Red line meant no investment, high risk. So there's been a lot of research since then about things like tree canopy, access to open space, quality of infrastructure tied back to the 1920s in that particular map. What we didn't know, we weren't expecting, and what came through geospatial analytics was the costs, the environmental costs and the health costs of redlining. So in the census tracts, we tracked over a 50-year period, the changes in demographics and the census tracts around the Durham Freeway. And Tom Schwan Wei, who's at ITRI, did analysis of air quality in proximity to the Durham Freeway. And there's a correlation not just between race and exposure to the noxious fumes from the Durham Freeway, but also the legacy of redlining. People in those red lines are highest risk. So even though that was generations ago, it's still having a forward public health impact. And this is just Durham. So there are 8 communities across the state where this is true, and there are hundreds across the country. So, in answer to that second question, what we tried to do is use geospatial analytics to describe and visualize spatial dynamics, demographic shifts, temporal shifts, and landscape performance patterns. Not at just the scale of someone's yard or someone's house, but at bigger scales, to see if these patterns inform us in terms of strategies of how to address them through design. So third question. I think I'm on time. It's great. What is the future of geospatial analytics in your field? It's a really good question. So there was reference to ASLA before. That's what ASLA stands for, American Society of Landscape Architects. It's the 150th birthday of ASLA this year, so we're all headed to DC in a couple of weeks to celebrate. But myself and a few colleagues a few years ago established an environmental justice professional practice network, which gives a home in that professional organization to look at these particular issues. So we're encouraged that because of that transformation, that we might have more disciplinary unity in looking at this. I'm a past president of this organization, the Landscape Architecture Foundation. And a few years ago, we issued the new Landscape Declaration. This was a response to the Declaration of Concern, which was written in 1966. Ian McCarg, who was on that screen previously, and a few other environmentalists all signed a letter saying, unless we change our ways, we're going to kill the planet. This is sort of the response to that initial call, which talks about the duty of landscape architects moving forward now that we know about global climate change and we know about issues of environmental justice and we know about biodiversity laws. We can't ignore that stuff. So thousands of people have signed this declaration. It's the first real statement in our profession that talks about environmental justice as a priority. It's really an amazing thing. We were able to host a summit several years ago. That's actually how I got to know Avery in the front row, who helped us work on developing projects and developing partnerships with the communities that could advance the Green New Deal. So the idea of decarbonization, justice, and jobs. How do we construct projects that could make those vague, broad policies more concrete for everyday people? And how can we position communities on the front lines facing these negative issues to be first in line when resources were developed? And so we worked in Charlotte with the community on that in that regard. But this actual summit was hosted at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. But moving forward in the future, there are new protocols and there are new training and new, more systematic ways of thinking about equity and justice, whereas geospatial analytics could play an incredible role. So this is an example. This organization is called Partnership for Southern Equity. It's based in Atlanta. They, several years ago, acquired a group called Eco Districts. Eco Districts was based in Portland, Oregon. Eco Districts had a protocol, right, where you could do the essentially advanced training and get certified in developing sustainable communities with an emphasis on governance and infrastructure and all the things that we like to talk about. And so once you were certified, that meant that you were able to lead really complex community conversations. But what Eco Districts realized is that they were really just looking at affluent, mostly white communities. Partnership for Southern Equity is the exact opposite. So when those two merged, that became the thing. How do you hold on to all those sustainable protocols that we know through the test of time have worked, but then add a racial equity lens to it, right? And make sure that the people who are most harmed and on the front lines of a lot of environmental issues are first in line for those issues. So a number of us served as advisors, which resulted in the Just Communities Protocol. And that's really a goal, is to start to use geospatial tools to deal with territories that are more social, more cultural, more qualitative. We have a lot of what we need and will have in the near future more with access to information on the non-human side of the world. Where we struggle and we continue to struggle is the human side. So one thought is moving forward, the advancement in our profession is not just to relegate the use of geospatial tools to non-human data sets, but to co-create with local people ways of seeing the environment, documenting it, and then using it in advocacy for positive environmental change. In this case, the interests of equity and regenerative development. We have tried this sort of pilot even before we got into that deep dive locally. Spent a lot of time in Kinston, North Carolina since I've been here, and working with Kinston teens and a few other folks, looking at places that have been in trouble and devastated since Hurricane Floyd, which has occurred before many of you in this room were born. Kinston in particular still has huge tracts of open space and open land, and they struggle with the ability to finance infrastructure and social programs and other elements, but teaming up with a local organization led by a dynamic young man, Chris Suggs, with Kinston Teens, we've been looking in partnership with the Design Workshop Foundation on how to start to build these just and equitable tools using geospatial technology and work. So some of that is more traditional stuff like mappings. This is a correlation of tree canopy and coverage in different block groups, and you can see the differences, in particular where we're working. Some of it is floodplain and its proximity to the Neuse River, and the impacts, the lingering impacts of flooding that happened during Hurricane Floyd in the 1990s. And then some of it is people power, right? Some of it is getting to know folks, going door to door, knocking people on people's porches, engaging them in different activities that encourage them to think about ways that they can play an active role in transforming the environment. And out of that bubbles values, right? And so in this case, because some communities feel like they've been planned and studied to death with no real tangible outcomes, this has been really focused on a real tangible outcome, right? A piece of property that this organization actually owns in a community that they have lined up funding for and support for, which they're calling the East Kinston Neighborhood Hub. That's a visualization of what they think it's going to look like. We'll see. But the idea that when we're thinking about geospatial work, it's sometimes in that realm of it's informing policy, it's communicating visualizing information very well. But when it gets down to how do we use it when we get down to the ground of actually implementing projects? That's what we've been exploring in this particular one. As Tanya mentioned, we did start a new lab in the college called the Just Communities Lab. And the goal is to use this kind of process and this kind of work. We have a number of really interesting projects that are underway now. Some of the ones on the screen aren't quite finished yet, but we're excited about the ability to continue to work on that. Those are some of the folks. A lot of them graduated, so we're going to be retooling them very soon. But yeah, Dr. Yee, Mira, Anthony, Joe, and Charlie were the first round. So with regards to the future, after that, I'm happy to answer some questions. The first one is that I think we'll, as a discipline, we'll further integrate geospatial analytics throughout the process. Right now, we do a lot of it in analysis and inventory, but we don't do anything with it after that. Right? So once you've used that tool to kind of read the site, figure out how the systems are working, then the design brain kicks on and all that stuff kind of goes away. But I think there are many reasons why we might want to pull that through, primarily to measure the impact of what we're doing, right? To be able to cycle that back in the system and to share what we've learned that worked and what didn't work. And at greater scales. So the idea that at a certain scale, you don't really need geospatial analytics, but at these vast scales with lots of players and stakeholders, you do. With the goal of implementation. So the idea that how can we tap it into systems that help good ideas get built and get sustained. We think that in the near term, justice and equity metrics are going to make their way into how we think about the use of the tool. Which means finding creative ways to code and analyze qualitative inputs, not quantitative, right? So people's perceptions and their memories and their histories and how they behave, as opposed to some of the categories we typically use. And that's really critical for scenario building, which means that we're gonna be moving into a future where you're not just gonna get one solution from a design challenge, right? You're gonna get multiple ones, right? And you're gonna have to see how they play out. Right? You're gonna have to test them to make sure that those scenarios are sturdy enough to do what you gotta do. And I think there's gonna be a split, right? There's gonna be some of the stuff that's like ease of use. You know, you can take your phone out there or your watch or, you know, whatever. I guess eventually your glasses, and you'll be able to gather whatever you want. But there's a bifurcation, right? There's another higher order of data that's very frustrating in terms of the barriers to access for communities. But generally speaking, we hope that the trend moves forward to ease of use and the potential for more community engagement and impact in decision making. So in the near future, I think our profession is moving that way. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you. What have been some effective strategies to connect with those local communities in order to kind of receive their inputs on some of these projects?
It's a good question. I'm old now, so I only go where I'm invited. So if I don't get invited, I don't go. So some of that means relationship building. So in the design world, we try and do everything we can within the scope of a project. You get a contract, you know, you get started, and as soon as that goes and the time limit for the resources for that project, define the depth of engagement that you can do, right? So it's like you start when you get the work and then you end when it's over. What we've tried to do is establish more long-term relationships with communities that don't have anything to do with design, right? So the folks in Ellerby Creek, it was like 10 years before we did that project. So this is a very unorthodox way of thinking about it, but relationship building with communities, in some cases, is more important than the project you're doing. So if there are ways to build relationships that aren't always putting them on the spot to respond and allow you to extract information, then you build trust. And the other part is not waiting to the end of the work for them to benefit from the work that you're doing. So sprinkling interim benefits throughout. So as an example, almost all those projects, we use maps all the time. We use spatial data all the time, all that stuff. They don't. So it's gonna sound stupid, but sometimes we would just give them the maps. How many maps you need? How big? How many copies do you need? That kind of stuff. Or a community group would be like, listen, we don't care about nothing you're talking about, but we got a couple people with sons and need summer jobs. You find a way to hire them, let them work on it, and we'll work it out, you know. So early on in projects, after we establish sort of a relationship, we have a very honest conversation about what we all need out of it. And, you know, sometimes I'm mean too. I'm like, listen, I need a paper. No disrespect, but, you know, I gotta get my count up. So if I can write a paper about this stuff, good. You know, sometimes communities are like, no, that's exploitation. Sometimes communities are like, oh yeah? Yeah, you need to hire like 10 people in our community. How about that? So it turns into this really interesting dynamic, but what's important is that before you even get started, everybody's expectations are on the table. And then you need milestones along the way to help people build momentum, right? What they call quick wins. So there are a lot of ways to do it, but you know, I'm gonna revert back to being old. Like it's, if I don't know you, it ain't working. I know it's a bad thing to say, but trust is really important in community. Establishing trust. Yes, ma'am.
Has language been a barrier during any of these projects, in particular to the Hispanic community that are also involved in one of these areas?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I think that we talked about sort of the evolving definition of what environmental justice means, and language barriers for sure are a part of it. So where that's a situation, make sure we have a partner that's bilingual or at least fluent in that local language. So the Ellerby Creek project I'll point to, in that footprint of that watershed, it's probably about 20% Latino and Hispanic. So we had a team member who, native Spanish speaker, everything from translating community materials to real-time and community meetings to being online, because we had a few Zoom sessions, who could help us, to overcome some of those language gaps. So it's one of those things where, you kind of got to know your limitations too. And so then you got to reach out, a partner and team. Yep. Yep. Yes.
With some of the projects you mentioned, or just in general with these environmental justice or landscape architecture projects, how much room or planning is there for post-project monitoring or impacts or, continued engagement with whatever community? I guess thinking specifically about the American Tobacco Trail as an example.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll be honest, in that project, there was nothing for that in terms of monitoring. The city leadership shifted and they shifted their priorities away from the tobacco trail. So a lot of those recommendations, which were in, I would say 2018-ish, sadly are kind of sitting there. But we know that now, and in some projects it is built in. So of them all that I showed, the Kinston one and the Ellery Creek one, because it's an organizational priority to say that you can't just kind of show up and propose all this stuff and then kind of walk away. That monitoring is kind of built in. But that's something to prearrange. And I'm gonna be honest with you, a lot of communities, it's changing, but a lot of communities don't understand the value of that. But in some cases because they're concerned about the cost of it, right? They don't want to deal with the bureaucracy of managing that process and paying people to do it. So that's an excellent opportunity for partnership with universities. I mentioned Landscape Architecture Foundation before. There's a landscape performance series there where there's a competitive grant program where if you make a proposal that you want to document a particular landscape based on its performance, they'll pay. They'll pay for the time for a research assistant to kind of do it. So there's a little bit of paperwork up front to organize it, but increasingly there are philanthropies, there are nonprofits, there are institutions like ours where a post-occupancy evaluation meets the academic goals, meets the research goals of the institution, and it can overlay with the needs of the community if you pick the right spot. This is a sidebar, but Nathaniel Smith, who's the director of Partnership for Southern Equity, became prominent nationally because he wrote equitable development plan guidelines for the Atlanta Beltline that were rejected. So he that organization saw the impact that massive project was going to have on adjacent property values, and they were trying to encourage the city to get ahead of it, right, to prevent displacement and gentrification. And Atlanta was like, no, we need all the monies, all the monies. But they literally took his plan verbatim and took it to Washington, D.C. For the, why am I spacing on the Bridge Park? Okay, so they turned a bridge over Anacostia River into a park. And they did implement his guidelines. And it kind of shamed Atlanta. They were kind of looking at, oh yeah, it's not displacing people, it's not gentrifying stuff, and people are getting local jobs. This plan was actually working. So the point I wanted to make is that organization, pretty extensive in terms of POE in multiple categories. So not even just the landscape performance, but what's the economic and socioeconomic impacts. It's the impacts on real estate. They have a lot of metrics kind of built in. So it's an interesting kind of sidebar. Yes.
The second, I guess, point on your last slide about moving into the future where you can start to quantify or incorporate people's perspectives and histories into geospatial outcomes or data. What are some of the challenges or needs for best practices and how that should be done?
There are a lot of them. I think we reward quantitative more than qualitative research. I think it's more, has more integrity. It's more replicable. I think that's probably the biggest thing, right? So qualitative research, you're not trying to replicate results, because how someone perceives something here now is gonna be totally different than someone across the street or 10 years from now. So I think the biggest challenge is dealing with that other values beyond how replicable the methodology and the work is, this investment in essentially a custom approach every time. And that's difficult when you're on a tight budget and there's a reward system for quantitative research where you don't have to do that, right? Someone does something about soils in Utah, you can take that paper and take that methodology and do it like across the street. But you can't do that with qualitative research. You have to build a relationship with people and get them in a situation. And so I think it's partnerships that's gonna help us do it. So there are other professions that are really good at that. So culture, anthropology, sociology, environmental psychology, like they're all, from my perspective, looking for opportunities to apply what they've learned, because a lot of it is kind of in space. I have a colleague in culture anthropology here. We used to get into these debates, right? So we're like, we do all this community engagement and we'd be all proud of ourselves. He's like, oh, that was superficial. You don't know nothing about that community. You just make a snap judgment so you can design some pretty stuff. And he was like, just going off on this. And I was like, yeah, well, you stayed in that village for 3 years. It's in a book in the library, nobody's gonna read. So we gotta find some common ground, right? The depth, the utility of the depth of engagement and the depth of trust. But that being said, there are things to learn from that deep, like authentic, fully textured engagement, like independent of its application. But as we apply it, it's putting filters on it, right? And I think that'll come from partnerships.
All right, let's give Kofi a round of applause. Rebecca has an announcement to make.
Yes, CGA picnic on Sunday. There's a lot of design students in the room. You're welcome to come as well. Sunday, 10-minute walk from here. If you can bring something, great. If you can't bring something, please don't come through.
What time, maybe? Where?
12 to 3 at a very nice little picnic area that I'm forgetting the name of. Parents Park. That's the one.
We also have refreshments down the hallway, 1214. Please stop by. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, they go.
Okay.